Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. What happens when a war against Russia turns into a war against Ukraine's own reformers? When a critic of corruption becomes a criminal suspect and silence becomes the soundtrack of international diplomacy? Welcome to the uncomfortable story of Vitaliy Shabunin, where democracy under fire starts to burn from within. At the start of the war, Ukraine's democracy was often described as imperfect but resilient, a young system that had survived revolutions, withstood oligarchs, and pushed back against Russian aggression. But over 3 years into the full-scale invasion, another danger is emerging, this time not from the Kremlin, but from Kyiv itself. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Ukraine's political theatre has become abuzz as anti-corruption activist Vitaliy Shabunin is set to appear in court. The man is one of the leading faces of Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts and has now become the target of an investigation that has sparked outrage. Ukrainian investigators suspect he has been evading military service while simultaneously claiming army pay worth around $1,200 per month. He has also allegedly been illegally using a military vehicle. Ukrainian authorities assure that the investigation has nothing to do with his professional activities. Many, however, disagree. 59 Ukrainian NGOs recently issued a joint call to Volodymyr Zelenskyy concerning the investigation, heavily criticizing it. Shabunin himself has called the case a, quote, step on the path to Zelenskyy's corrupt authoritarianism. A lawmaker from Zelenskyy's own party has also criticized the investigation. Other critics have pointed to double standards being in use. While investigators go after people accused of fairly low-level wrongdoings, high-ranking officials accused of corruption remain untouched. Many activists have warned that Shabunin's campaigning for more government transparency has made him several powerful enemies. Should he be convicted of these crimes, he would face up to 10 years in prison.
And now let's zone in on the East-plaining portion of our show. Before the war, Ukraine's fight wasn't just against Russia, it was against corruption. At the center of that battle stands NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Nearly a decade after its creation, as war reshapes priorities and political pressure mounts, is NABU still a force for justice, and how does it fare in accomplishing its goals?
Corruption is modern Ukraine's longest-standing enemy. The country has grappled with the issue of corruption ever since it gained independence from the Soviet Union's ashes. That isn't to say that Ukrainian authorities haven't tried to tackle this very difficult problem. One of the key conditions for Ukraine joining the European Union is cracking down on corruption, so the matter is of vital importance to the Ukrainian state and people. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, or NABU, is one major method of approaching the problem. A decade or so after its establishment, however, the results have been mixed. While external independent assessment has judged NABU as moderately effective, Ukrainians themselves either don't trust the body or outright don't know what it is for. It has had a string of successful indictments, convictions, and asset recoveries. Since the start of the Russian invasion, NABU has been focused on the defense, energy, and reconstruction sectors. Its actions have led to billions being recovered for these purposes. Yet these successes have recently been overshadowed by the case of the probe into former defense minister Rustem Umerov over arms procurement conflicts. Reported political interference has been hampering this investigation, putting NABU's independence as a body into question.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Vitaliy Shabunin, Ukraine's most prominent anti-corruption activist and co-founder of the Anti-Corruption Action Center, is now officially under criminal investigation for draft evasion. Now, that accusation might make sense if he hadn't volunteered for military service in the first days of the invasion. Instead, the real crime appears to be his activism. In recent years, especially since the war began, Shabunin has been one of the few voices consistently calling out corruption at the top, criticizing government failures in arms procurement, questioning shady defense contracts, and confronting President Zelenskyy's aides Andriy Yermak and Oleg Tatarov. And now, the system he spent over a decade trying to reform is coming after him. The escalation of the case is chilling. His home in Kyiv was searched, his military base near the front line was raided. Authorities weren't after weapons, state secrets, or missing paperwork. They wanted his phone. Let that sink in. Ukraine's law enforcement, amid a brutal war, prioritized silencing an anti-corruption activist over rooting out the corruption he exposed. And this isn't an isolated incident. It's becoming part of a disturbing pattern. In just the past month, Ukraine's government has blocked the appointment of a lawfully selected independent head of the Bureau of Economic Security, used the National Security and Defense Council to impose sanctions with questionable legal basis, not against oligarchs or traitors, but political opponents like former President Petro Poroshenko, and now it appears to be prosecuting a soldier-turned-reformer under the guise of justice. Now let's be clear, Ukraine is not Russia, far from it, but it cannot win this war while drifting towards a Russian-style governance. If the democratic values Ukraine claims to defend are abandoned at home, what exactly is the point of this fight? The same President Zelenskyy who once sat down publicly with Shabunin to champion anti-corruption reforms now presides over a government that treats reformers like saboteurs. And yet, where is the outrage? The G7, once quick to issue warnings over judicial backsliding, has been silent. The EU, keen to tie funding to reforms, barely reacted, and here's the danger. If the Shabunin affair goes unchecked, it sets a precedent. And that wartime discipline means political obedience, that to criticize is to betray, and the war gave Ukraine a moral high ground, but it also gave the government unprecedented power under martial law, powers that now risk being abused. President Zelenskyy has two choices: either distance himself from this campaign and restore the line between justice and revenge, or own it, and with it, the responsibility for turning Ukraine's democracy into something it was never meant to be. The choice will define not just his presidency, but the very soul of the country. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Taras Kuzio, a political science professor from National University of Kyiv Academy. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for inviting me.
So today we're trying to unpack the case with Vitaliy Shabunin, and it's quite convoluted and not very well covered in Western media. So if we were to bring this to the forefront of kind of a consciousness, what's the narrative around it and how is it being described right now?
Well, the main opposition political forces in the Ukrainian parliament, such as European Solidarity, the largest one led by former President Petro Poroshenko, and the other political force, Holos. Both of these have condemned the use of state institutions to try to criminally indict Mr. Shabunin. So there has been criticism, and the criticism has also followed the fact that similar kinds of use of state institutions to allegedly fight corruption, but really just to fight people who are critical of the president, was previously used against Poroshenko himself. So this Ukrainian political force, European Solidarity, the main opposition force in the Ukrainian parliament, it's a center-right political force. They already understand this kind of misuse of state institutions, which the President Zelenskyy is undertaking.
And do you think these accusations have any validity? Now, the way I read it is that some of the most prominent anti-corruption activists is being targeted by kind of state authorities as well. Do you think there's more behind that to unpack, or do you think that there is some sense in calling this as sort of a democratic backsliding?
Well, I think there's probably something there that maybe that he didn't quite do correct. But the fact is that this didn't require the authorities to go after him in such a manner. So I think that they are using maybe a mistake he did make because he joined the armed forces and tried to continue his civil society work at the Anti-Corruption Center's NGO. He also tried to continue that work. So he tried to maybe sit on two chairs at the same time, being in the army and doing his civil society work. Maybe he infringed some rules, but this has, I think, been exaggerated and been used by Zelenskyy. And I think the root issue here is that, and I don't think this is really addressed by Europe and by Western countries, because the longer this war goes on, the more there will be this kind of political stagnation or democratic stagnation, whatever you want to call it, because there has not been any elections since 2019. And you can't have elections during a war when there is martial law in the country. So I think that that is really the crux of the problem. There needs to be an end to the war so that Ukraine can return to being a democracy, where you return to being accountability of politicians in power. I think the longer this goes on without elections, the longer there will be this kind of democratic, as you call it, democratic backsliding. Um, so we need to focus on ending the war, either by negotiations, by pressuring Russia to come to the negotiating table, or by Russia being militarily defeated. One of the two.
And do you think there's an argument to be made that, well, Ukraine's still being under martial law and needed to be extra cautious when it comes to potential challenges to Zelensky's rule, and in turn also damaging the wartime efforts against Russia?
But that is the case. I mean, I think that the level of criticism by opposition politicians and in the media is probably less than it would be in a kind of a non-war situation. I think that is true already. So the president and his political force, a servant of the people, are already getting off the hook in some ways, because they're not being subjected to the kind of the more severe level of responsibility, criticism, condemnation that would normally take place if there wasn't a war taking place. So that's already happening, and so I think that this kind of shall we say, call it democratic backsliding, is going to continue as long as there is no elections, as long as there is no turnover of politicians, of people, because they've already been there for 6 years, and Zelensky's already been president for 6 years. And that inevitably leads to, I think, a kind of a natural desire to concentrate power in his hands, because, of course, Russia is an existential threat to Ukraine. So all of these factors are there. And I think one factor that might be amusing, but it's certainly my experience, is that post-communist, post-Soviet culture also is inherited in a kind of a micromanagement culture.
Right.
So I think Zelensky is at fault here, that he doesn't really want to kind of work with say, for example, opposition forces. One of the criticisms of Zelensky has been that he's been unwilling, for example, to create a government of national unity, which Israel did after it was attacked in October 2023, but Ukraine has not done. And that would be surely a better way of uniting the country than having different forces going their own way.
And speaking of turnover of politicians, we've recently seen the replacement of the prime minister. Now, people are also coming at both sides of this. One saying that, well, perhaps this is out of necessity to have a change in personnel to inject some new blood, new energy into the system. However, some other also argue that the individual put in charge is also very closely tied to the head of the presidential office and can be seen by the opposition as another move to consolidate power as well. What's your take on this?
Well, Ukraine is a parliamentary presidential system, and so we should be aware of this, that the government is appointed by parliament, not by the president. And in the 27 post-communist states, the countries which have been most successful in democratizing their systems have been parliamentary systems. It's usually presidential systems in Eurasia, like, for example, Russia, or in Central Asia, that have become authoritarian systems. So Ukraine is part of that more East European parliamentary system. But of course, President Zelensky, through his political forces in the Ukrainian parliament, is in effect doing musical chairs. I mean, these his allies are, yes, they're changing seats in the government, but they're all pretty much Zelensky's people. She's very competent. The Americans were very surprised at how competent she was in negotiating the rare minerals deal between Ukraine and the US. So I'm sure she's very competent, and it's a very good step forward that we have a woman prime minister. Remember that Canada and the United States have never had a female president or prime minister. But it does feel a bit like musical chairs. That these are basically Zelensky's people. Just kind of every year or so, they just change their positions in the government.
And like you mentioned earlier, Zelensky do enjoy a little bit of leniency when it comes to how he operates within his country, which rightfully due to the wartime condition, one could imagine that. But this incident has been drawing a little bit of attention compared to the previous iterations. Do you think that the fact that this activist being targeted is also on the high profile for anti-corruption and might tie into Ukraine's probably less stellar reputation when it comes to this front, might have some unintentional backfiring when it comes to international PR?
Well, possibly, but I mean, the real issue, as I say again, is that the longer this war goes on, the more difficult it will be for Ukraine to prevent itself from doing this democratic backsliding, because you don't have the possibility of either local elections. I mean, Ukraine underwent a very, very radical decentralization 10 years ago, which gave a lot of power to local councils. But they were elected, a long time ago. So they need changing. And so I think you do need that change of personnel. In the case of Zelensky, he's done a pretty good job as president. Just prior to the full-scale invasion, most Ukrainians didn't have very much faith in Zelensky being a great commander-in-chief. They were proven wrong. He has done very well in mobilizing international support. I mean, I don't know how he keeps going half the time, visiting various countries, giving speeches. But at the same time, there are inevitably going to be questions about his unwillingness to, for example, to create this government of national unity, unwillingness to not use state institutions. I mean, these state institutions, which are there to fight real corruption, were previously used against the former president, Petro Poroshenko. Zelensky has a personal conflict with him, obviously, and now they're used against Shabunin. That is wrong. On the question of whether this would derail Ukraine's integration into Europe, I doubt it very much, because that path to EU membership is going to be long anyway. I'm a bit skeptical of how long that will take, because it's one thing Western leaders to say, yes, you will join down the road. It's another thing for it to happen in reality. I mean, let's see how Western countries said for 17 years that Ukraine would join NATO, and all of a sudden this year they said no, that won't happen. So I'm a kind of a bit skeptical. Ukraine seems to be doing the reforms that the European Union wants it to do, even in this wartime environment. So there does seem to be progress. But so I think this is one area that Western countries and Brussels in particular should tell Zelensky to back off, leave Poroshenko alone, and leave Shabunin alone.
All right. Thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us unpack this delicate situation. Thanks for being with us on TVP World. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Russia's chemical attacks in Ukraine have exceeded 10,000 incidents since February 2023. Kyiv's top chemical defense official confirms that toxic attacks began as early as 2014.
Ukraine's top official for chemical defense says that Russia started using chemical weapons against Ukraine as early as 2014. What's more, Ukrainian authorities claim that since February 2023, Russian use of chemical attacks in Ukraine has exceeded 10,000 incidents. This month alone, Kiev reported 760 instances of Russian troops using chemical weapons. There are currently several mobile teams specializing in chemical detection deployed across the front line. Their objective is to collect samples of grenades, chemically contaminated gear, and aerosols. Kiev authorities say that close to 90% of Russian chemical attacks involve hand grenades. These are banned from being used in combat under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Another agent that is apparently widely being used by the Russians is chloropistrin, which in the past was used to test gas masks. It has reportedly been weaponized and is used in improvised explosive devices or loaded into containers that are later dropped from drones.
The sanctions work as long as we abide by them. A subsidiary of Danish inspection company Baltic Control helped Russian firms export hundreds of tons of grain from occupied Berdyansk between March 2024 and May 2025.
Leaked documents by Ukrainian investigators show that a subsidiary of the Danish inspection company Baltic Control has helped Russian companies export at least over 170,000 tons of grain from occupied Ukraine. The vast majority of the grain reportedly came through occupied Berdyansk between March 2024 and May 2025. The subsidiary in question is called Baltic Control Novorossiysk and is registered in Russia. The main company, operating out of Denmark, positions itself as a leading global inspection and certification firm with more than 50 offices across the globe. Neither the Russian branch nor the Danish parent company have responded to written inquiries into the matter. The Russian subsidiary is to provide crucial inspection services which enable grain shipments from the occupied port of Berdyansk to take place.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.